Hello all, we are going to take a look at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura that took place in 2009 in Rapid. It was Rapid game. Carlsen was playing white and Carlsen starts with c4, knight f6. c4 is a positional move, extremely known, extremely robust. Knight f6, knight c3, g6, e4, bishop g7. Well, this is strange because there is move e5 here, and usually this is not something that I would want to allow. But if Nakamura plays this way, it means that e5 is not as dangerous. e5, knight g8, d4, d6, f4, capture, capture, c5. So maybe this is the reason that essentially Nakamura allowed this move, and most likely this is not particularly good for white. So Nakamura allows to play e5, and Magnus doesn't use this possibility because most likely the center crumbles after. Knight f3. Instead, Magnus plays knight f3, d6, d4, castle. So we have a standard position of King's Indian, which used to be one of Hikaru Nakamura's favorite weapons. Bishop e2, e5, bishop e3, knight a6. Well, there are a lot of ways to do here. One of the ways to proceed, unorthodox and a bit unusual, is to capture on d4. This is simplistic move. It doesn't offer as much of a game to black, but it still exists. For example, capture on d4, knight, rook e8, a bit better f3, knight c6, castle. Now the usual move now is knight to h5, and what is the purpose of this move? The purpose of this move is, strangely, is to jump to f4. And if black jumps to f4, for example, queen d2, and there is now knight f4. So this is why I think that queen d2 is not a great option. If capture on f4, then black captures on d4. If capture on c6, then there is an intermediate capture on e2. And this is quite good. So I think that instead of playing queen d2, it would be better to play rook e1. Okay, so this is another option, but this move is not popular. Nakamura instead plays knight to a6, knight to a6, castle. Carlsen answers with castle, knight g4, bishop to g5, f6. No, Nakamura doesn't play f6. Despite f6, it somehow feels like a popular move, and it most likely known theoretical position. f6, bishop h5, h5, maybe h3, g3. I don't know actually what to do here, but after h3 maybe g5 or maybe knight h6. I somehow feel that the position is strange. It's difficult to say anything about this position. It's strange. Okay, let's get back. Nakamura played queen e8. e8, and Carlsen captures on e5. Capture on e5. Oh, I guess that just black has to capture on e5 with a knight. That's all. Strangely, it's really strange what Nakamura does. Knight e5 seems like a more natural move to me. Knight d5. If knight d5, then knight f3, bishop f3, bishop b2. And this is not good. Knight f6, bishop f6, bishop f6. This is not good. Knight e5, knight d5. And there is somehow a feeling that square f6 is weak. So what black can do in order to defend f6 square? Maybe black, if black plays queen e6, there is knight d4 attacking the queen. And maybe black doesn't have at all to defend f6, but then white would play knight f6, check. For example, if black plays c6, then white would play knight f6, bishop f6, bishop f6. And the bishop on f6 is very strong. Maybe actually is quite strong. In this kind of positions, it's good to have the dark squared bishop. It might be very powerful. Okay, let's go back. So Nakamura captured with the pawn, and unexpectedly a capture with a knight would be more expected for me. So he captured with a pawn. What white can do in this situation is essentially, if we look at the position, then we see that it kind of balanced, but there is a hole on d4. There is a hole on d4. And if black essentially puts a knight into this hole, then black would have a good position. But black has to make several moves. Black has to make knight a6 to c5 to e6 to d4. And now it's white's turn. So what white would do? Now it's white's turn. What white would do? Maybe knight d5 is a thing to consider. I would consider definitely knight d5. And if c6, then there is knight e7. And if there is check, king h8, and maybe just then take on c8, knight c8, rook c8. Also, white could play queen c2 and then rook a to d1. And another line is to try to play h3. There is this knight on g4, and essentially kind of this knight, if we I don't know, but it's just not clear. If I play h3, for example, he goes back with his knight to f6. Does it make white's position better? Does it make white's position worse? Is this move get better? But I would. It seems to me that knight d5 is the best move. It's kind of the best. No, at least this is not the move that Carlsen made. Carlsen played queen c1. Queen c1. Unexpected move, and Carlsen makes unexpected move, and we can be nearly sure that this move is not bad. Queen c1. Let's think for a moment what black can do. There are various things, there are various moves. Well, again, it seems that Ideally, black would want to play c6 and then knight c5, knight e6, and knight d4. This is the most natural plan to me. If black plays immediately knight c5, then black has to keep in mind that there is knight d5, and it kind of seems a bit kind of, for example, knight c5, knight d5, knight, there is a pawn e4 hanging. If capture on e4, then capture on c7 is, and black is losing in exchange. But so c6, and we want to. I think that c6 and kind of guarding d5 square, or bishop e6. But after bishop, no. But I don't think that bishop e6 is good. Bishop e6, knight d5, bishop takes d5, c takes d5, and then there is a square c5 that is controlled by the queen, and then there is no move knight to c5, and the knight on a6 is standing without business. So I think that c6 is a move that I would consider. Okay, so c6 was played in the game. Nakamura played c6, and now it's Magnus' turn. It's white's turn. Maybe usually this move queen c1 goes with the threat of playing bishop h6, and essentially now there is no bishop h6 because there is just a capture bishop h6, and the game is lost. So maybe first to play rook d1, maybe first to play h3, knight f6, and then bishop h6, and another move to consider is to play. So essentially, white can play h3 is a kind of natural move, and white can play rook d1, and then there is knight c5, and somehow white has to defend the pawn e4. I think that I would go for h3, and then there is knight f6, and also there are moves like h6, for example, h3, h6, h takes g4, h takes g5, queen g5, and white wins a pawn. So h6 is not actually a good move. But okay, h3 is one moment. Thank you for your patience. So h3, knight f6, and maybe then bishop h6, and it might be good for white to exchange the bishops. Otherwise, it's just difficult to propose a meaningful move for me. So let's see what happened in the game. Carlsen plays rook d1. He doesn't go for h3 like like I thought it was worthy. So now black can play knight c5. Definitely seems like an interesting move. No, Nakamura didn't play knight c5, but if he played knight c5, knight c5. Ah, okay, so I'm actually didn't see that the pawn e4 is defended by the knight, so pawn e4 is not actually attacked, but still this move is looking pretty reasonable to me. Knight c5, and there is an idea to play knight e6 and knight d4. Oh, it's difficult to play this position for white because there are no obvious and good moves. Maybe h3, knight f6, bishop h6, and there is now a capture on e4, so white has to do nothing. So knight c5, I would consider this. Knight c5. Instead, Nakamura plays f6. He forces the bishop to go away. The bishop is attacked, and there are essentially a couple of moves. There are no counter moves while the bishop is attacked. The bishop has to retreat. If the bishop goes to e3, then there is a capture on e3, and it's not a worthy thing for white. So bishop either has to go to d2 or bishop has to go to h4. And if bishop goes to h4, then it's more passive. There are moves like g5, bishop g3, and h5. Then there is h4, but still bishop to h4 is more passive. So bishop d2, bishop d2. Now it's black's turn, and black has to well, I always want to play knight c5, knight e6, and knight d4. And it also would be wonderful to develop rook a8 to d8 square. It would be wonderful. Kind of, it would be normal, but it also would be wonderful at the same time. And another thing to note is that there is now so Carlsen created actually a subtle threat with his last move, and maybe you want to find yourself what is this subtle threat. Maybe you should pause the video for a couple of seconds. And the threat is actually to play h3 and to capture, to trap the knight on g4. The knight on g4 is not going to have any squares to retreat to, since square h6 is attacked twice with the help of so-called X-ray. So if black plays knight h6, then knight is going to be captured. Bishop h6, and queen h6. So the knight is going to be captured, and it's going to be trapped. So now black has to decide anything, and it's difficult to see any other move than to play f5 in this position. Whether it's good or bad. Another move other than f5 is g5. So I see two kind of meaningful moves in this position, and they are f5 and g5. and it seems that I have to decide which move to go for. F5 is more risky, G5 is more solid, but also leaves bishop more dumb. And there is G5, H3, knight has to go back to H3, H6, knight H6, and then I see that there is a powerful, at least seemingly powerful move H4, which creates a hell of a lot of attacks on G5. And after the pawn G falls, it might be over for black. So of two moves, G5 and F5, it seems that there is no G5. So let's see what Nakamura did. Okay, Nakamura played F5 like I thought he would. And he should, because other than that, there was no moves. Okay, so Carlsen has it's Carlsen's move now. It's white move. Nakamura played F5, and I kind of don't. I think that F5 is kind of weakening. It seems to weaken the position, because okay, there was no choice, and other than F5 there was nothing to do. Nothing to do. Maybe H3, and if knight F6, and then knight F6, and white would want to develop rook A to the game. I also think that it would be preferable to push the knight G4 back to the backyard with something like H3, and if capture on E4, F takes E4, H takes G4, capture on F3, bishop takes F3. It seems like knight C5. Oh, it seems like maybe not bad position for white to me. And if other than H3, there are moves like if Queen C2, then Knight B4, and other than that, maybe there is like I think how to essentially untangle the pieces of white, how white can kind of get the rook A1 into the game, and white has to think. Now there is also like there is this move bishop E1, I see now, untangling, and maybe then queen D2. Oh, no, I probably would go for H3. H3 and bishop E1 like are two most interesting moves, but it seems to me that H3 is better. And other than H3 or bishop E1, it's difficult to see anything, because okay, there is rook B1. It's difficult to find useful move for white. There is rook B1 with an idea of B4. Also something to consider. There is this move rook B1, and black has to think what to do. So also rook B1 is maybe a good idea. So maybe, but rook B1, capture on E4, F takes E4, knight E4, bishop F5, bishop D3, rook D8, and it's easier to play this position with black than with white. But still, I think that H3 is the most natural way to proceed. Okay, so f5 was played. 5 was played, and Carlsen answers with h3. So okay, Nakamura has to either to capture on e4 or to go to f6. I think that if he captures on e4, it doesn't seem particularly good. Knight f6 seems much better. I just think knight f6 was played. Knight f6 was played, so now white has to do something. And there are no weaknesses in black's camp, and maybe rook b1 other than rook b1 and b4. But okay, now black has some threats, so I pay attention that there is pawn e4 hanging, and there is probably a threat of capturing on e4. But I don't know actually how much of a real threat this is, since if, for example, if I play rook b1, if white plays rook b1, knight capture on e4, knight capture on e4, f captures on e4, knight to g5, it might be difficult to defend this pawn on e4. And if white manages to recapture the pawn back with the knight, it might be a good position, blockaded position. So knight g5, bishop f5, g4, might be h6, g takes f5, h takes g5, f takes g6, queen takes g6. I think that it's going to be a weakened position for white. But okay, other than that, white can either capture on f5 with e takes, captures on f5, and black is going to be able to capture on f5 with a bishop or with a pawn, and it seems quite passive after e takes on f5, g takes on f5, and there is imminent e4 coming. But so this capture on f5 isn't going, doesn't look good to me. And so we can capture, white can capture, white can defend, and white can ignore the threat with a move like rook b1. A defensive move is queen to c2, queen to c2, and queen c2, trying to defend pawn e4. If f take captures on e4, then knight captures on e4, bishop f5. There is a pin, and it's unpleasant, but then there is queen c2, capture on e4, with a knight, bishop f5, bishop d3, the only move, and knight well, maybe queen c2 is a good thing if this variation doesn't lose by force, because this variation might actually pretty well end up losing losing everything. And there is knight b4, queen c2. I also pay attention that there is a move knight b4, queen has to go to b1, it seems, since queen b3, also queen b3, a5, there is move a5 and a3, knight a6, queen c2. Well, or queen b1. So queen c2 is actually, probably queen c2 is going to work. Okay, so if I play queen c2, then there is another move, knight c5. Like knight c5. The attack on e4 is strong, so white would need to capture on f5. And if queen c2, knight c5, e takes f5, bishop f5, and white is worse. The overall feeling is that Carlsen is worse in this position. So maybe queen b1, queen b1, maybe queen b1, still knight c5, problem. Yeah, the position is unpleasant, and forcing white to capture on f5, which is going to be worse. So maybe after queen is placed on b square or c square, since queen is going to be attacked and black is going to gain another tempo. Okay, so maybe bishop d3. White's position isn't particularly easy to play. Capture on f5 it doesn't seem good. Queen c2 doesn't seem good. Rook b1 doesn't seem good. All the continuation don't seem good for white. It means that white's position is not good. So white has to now to choose among several difficult continuations, and I think that I would go for maybe rook b1. Okay, no, Carlsen instead captures on f5. Capture on f5, and now black has to capture on f5. It seems to me that g takes on f5 is significantly preferable to capture the bishop f5. No, Nakamura doesn't think so. But, if g takes f5, it's a good position for black. If now bishop d3, e4, losing a piece. If rook e1, still e4, knight d4. Oh, it still seems like a good position to me for black. But Nakamura captured on with the bishop. It's still pretty good. White hardly. It's difficult to propose moves for white. I see a move bishop e3, which is kind of consolidating, and knight h4, which is attacking, so bishop would need to retract to bishop h6, and ideally white would want to put something on e4 and to create a blockade, something like knight g5 with g4, but and if white can do this, it is going to be probably good for white. So another option is to consider is to play g4, bishop e6, knight to g5, and to try to create a blockade. But is it going to work tactically? For example, g4, e4, knight capture on f5, capture on f3, and it doesn't look good to white for white at all. So g4, e4, there is this counter move. So maybe bishop e3. Okay, bishop h6. Carlsen played bishop h6. Nakamura captures on h6. Queen captures on h6. e4. Knight h4. Carlsen plays knight h4. Queen e5. Seems that if now white captures on f5, knight f5, g takes f5, then rook d2 maybe. It seems that black center is so good. g4 is a move to consider. Maybe g4, unexpected move. g4, bishop e6, and knight g2, but it weakens the position, white's position significantly. Maybe queen e3, no, maybe queen e3 and rook e1 and bishop f1 trying to attack. So yeah, it might be interesting. Queen e3, no, g4. Carlsen might be interesting. Carlsen plays g4, bishop e6, queen e3. Carlsen created the blockade of the pawn e4. A natural way to continue for black would be to play rook a2 e8, which was played by Nakamura. f4. Magnus makes this move. Now capture and passant on f3. E takes f3 is impossible, because is possible but losing due to queen e5. There is just a queen hanging on e5, and that's it. So black has to go back to c7 or to c5. There are several alternative moves. Queen c5, queen c7. Has to choose something. Maybe queen c5 looks like more interesting to me, since it would after capture queen c5, knight c5, knight would approach the center, but there is a move before coming after that. But it weakens, it seems to weaken white's position. Queen c5, knight c5 before. Knight c to d7, g5, knight h5, knight e4. There is a pawn e4 hanging, but then there is rook f4. So it is normal for black. So I would go for queen c5, which was played. Queen c5, knight to g2. Carlsen doesn't want to lose in the position to, since queen capturing on c5 would make knight a6 closer to the center of the board. So he plays knight g2, h5 attack, queen c5, knight c5, there is massive okay, there are weak spots in white position, and there is promoting pawn e. If white plays g5, then knight d7 and b4, knight a6, and knight e4. Then bishop h3. There is bishop h3. Oh, it looks interesting, and there is knight d6. Just to get the knights away, and then capture on e4. g5, knight d7, b4, knight a6, knight e4. Seems interesting, and maybe it's the strongest continuation in the position. I have to decide more certainly if there are any intermediate moves to consider that would refute this variation. And another option is to start the same line with b4, but there is a difference, since after b4 I see there is knight d3, bishop d3, capture on d3, rook d3, bishop c4. And after d7, after g5, knight to d7, b4, maybe still, okay, maybe still there is this move, knight d3. But no, knight d3 is met with knight e4. So it's not as strong as for black as when white starts this variation with b4. So g5, I would go for g5. Okay, knight e3. Magnus plays knight e3. Capture on g4, capture on g4. Knight to d7. Goes to d7. Black has created a threat of attacking f4 pawn. If white plays something like f5, then capture on f5, g takes f5, g takes f5, bishop f5, knight f5, rook f5. There doesn't seem to be a compensation for the pawn, so white has to play rook f1. Rook f1, and okay, so Nakamura continues rook e7. Apparently Nakamura's idea is to play rook e to f7 and to create double attack on f4 square. And if Nakamura plays this, then the only way to defend f4 pawn is going to be with move knight to g2. But it's good to create pressure on white's position. King to g2. Carlsen probably wants to defend the f4 pawn with his king. Knight d3. No, Nakamura doesn't go for rook e to f7. And then Carlsen would play king g3. Probably Carlsen has something better in mind. Knight d3, king g3 still, knight c5. On the previous move, if white captured on e4, knight e4, then there would be capture on f4. Knight e4, knight f4 check, and black is just winning, I think, since there is a bishop e2 hanging, and apparently king f2 is going to be very bad for white. After something, I just want to believe that this something actually exists in the position. I'm pretty sure that it does. Okay, so knight e4, knight f4, knight king f, knight f4 check, king to f2, and now there should be some very powerful discovered check, since there is this rook f8 standing still. Maybe there is discovered check, knight to d5, and now white has to play bishop f3, since otherwise there would be a capture on e3, bishop e3, and then there is a move knight e5, attacking the bishop f3, and if capture on d5, then rook f3, king e2, rook f1, rook f1, c captures on d4, on d5. Okay, it all should be pretty sad for white. So king g3, Nakamura plays knight to c5, b3, a6, rook a to d1, b5, bishop d3, capture on d3, b4, knight c5 is attacked, knight has to go away, and e4 square is controlled, so it's knight a4 also doesn't make sense, knight a4, knight a4, there is no sense, so it's only knight d7. No, I was wrong. It's not only knight d7. Nakamura finds something brilliant, some move that I would describe as brilliant, brilliantly looking at it. He found that in the position there is a discovered attack on the knight, and instead of retracting the knight to d7, he counterattacked the knight e3 with the withdrawal of his bishop to f7, and now white has to react, and the capture on c5 is not doesn't look very good. B takes c5, rook e3, rook f3, rook captures on f3, king captures on f3, and there is a capture on c4, and black is going to have an extra pawn and apparently a winning position if white goes to this variation. Capture on c5, capture if b takes c5, capture on e3, rook f3, rook f3, king f3, bishop c4. Apparently it's an extra pawn for black and a good position and a winning position. So white has to do something else other than that, and it might be either retracting the knight to some position or defending the knight. And there are two ways to defend it with rook, either rook to e1 and doing it with rook d doesn't make a lot of sense. Autoplay rook f3, which makes more sense. So it's either rook f to e1 or rook f3. But after and rook e1, for example, rook e1, knight to e4, knight captures e4, and rook captures e4. Rook, there is a pawn c4, then hanging. Well, I would go for rook e1, I think. Rook f3. No, Carlsen doesn't play like I do. Like I would rook f3, knight e4, No, again, Nakamura finds a more taking move. Rook e8 is more taking move. He again counterattacks the knight on e3, and usually counterattacks which improve the position of the pieces on board are a good thing. King f2, knight e4, knight captures on e4, and rook captures on e4. Now white has there is pawn d3 hanging, so white can capture now with a pawn with rook d3. But all white can first capture on b5, since if white captures on d3, rook d3, then there is pawn c4, there is going to be hanging, and there would be a move like bishop c4 or d takes c4. So it makes a lot of sense to just first play c takes b5, and only after that play rook d3. So I recommend playing c takes b5. And again, Carlsen deviates from what I'm recommending him, and probably there is a good reason for that. And what is this reason? If capture on b5, capture on b5 with pawn c or a, I don't see a lot of difference in this. Rook d3, and now what I missed is that there are two pawns hanging, a2 and pawn b. So this variant isn't probably isn't a lot better. It probably is more or less like my variant, but so white is still going to lose a pawn, and maybe there is some extra compensation after bishop a2. There is a pawn b4 which is problematic. So this is the reason why probably he captured on. There was a capture on d3 and not capture on b5, so he played rook b5. So there is pawn c4 hanging. Black has to capture on c4. It makes a lot of sense both with the bishop and with the pawn, and there is move b2 c4 looks better to me. b2 c4, rook to d6. There is extra pawn which is passing, and a great position, but now white threatens to capture on c6, and if pawn c6 falls, and there might then a pawn a6 might fall. A pawn a6 might fall, and even in some distant future, white, strangely enough, might get a better position. And I guess that we all understand how dangerous it is in the hands of Magnus Carlsen. There is move bishop d5, and then knight d5. There is some check on e2, but I don't know how dangerous this check actually is. Bishop d5, knight d5, rook e2, king g3, c takes d5, rook d5, and there is a capture on a2. There is a pawn a2 that would be hanging in this variation. Bishop d5, knight d5, rook e2, king g3, e take, c capture d5. There are two very dangerously looking passing pawns. Rook captures on d5, rook captures on a2. Rook goes back to the white. Okay, but it's not black. It doesn't have an extra pawn, so it shouldn't be an advantage for black in this position, especially if at the end of this variation, white goes to d6, rook d6. So it should be a draw. And to defend rook e6 defends the pawn. Rook e6. The question was which rook, but probably either of them. Just rook e6. Let's defend the pawn. Now there is move knight c4, which defends the rook, and but this move is bad because there is a rook e2 check and there is a capture on c4, and there is going to be discovered attack on c4, and knight is going to be captured. So white has no option of defending the rook. The rook either going to be exchanged on e6, or the rook is going to withdraw to on file D, on D file. And if white plays rook e6, then there is going to be bishop e6, since after knight c4 there is no rook e2, but then there is rook e4. There is rook e4, but I don't think it's good because there is knight e5. So rook e6, bishop e6, and f5, capture on f5, g takes f5, knight takes f5, rook d8 with advantage. And if white goes back to on d2, still there is a pawn, but well, it's difficult for me to decide which one is better. Carlsen plays rook d8, rook e4, rook d6, rook to c8. Nakamura came to conclusion that the maneuver with the rooks, with the rook e4 to e6 wasn't strong, and the position repeated itself. He could go to e6, but then the position would repeat itself, and he has an advantage. So he has all the reasons to continue the game. He decides to try another approach, which is to play rook c8. Now white has a powerful rook on d6. It's white move, and there are natural moves. A natural move is to play f5. Okay. Knight d1. Expectedly, Carlsen makes the move which differs from what I recommend, as he often did during this game. Knight d1. Okay. Since maybe f5 is met with c5. I see now that there is a c5 which is might be a threat. Might be, I'm not sure. c5, f5, c5, b takes c5, rook c5. But the idea is that rook c is going to help to advance the c pawn. f5, c5. No, f5, c5 is not an option, since there is a capture on g6, f takes g6, so it's not an option. So f5 is still something that an interesting looking move to me. But Carlsen decides to block c4, c pawn with knight d1, and to go for a block. Knight d1, bishop d5, knight c3, rook d4, knight king g3, king f7. Black has a pawn, an extra pawn. Black doesn't have an extra pawn. 1, 2. White has 4 pawns and black has 4 pawns. Unlike what I thought previously, black doesn't have an extra pawn. And accordingly, black's advantage is not as big as I thought. But black has centralized position of the pieces and the passing pawn, and black still has an advantage, despite not having an extra pawn. king f3, rook d4, king g3. Now black cannot capture on f3. Maybe it's not as good since there is going to be a capture on d4. King f7. And this position might be as difficult to play as the position with big amount of pieces. So the reduction of the material on board doesn't necessarily make the position easier to play. Knight capture d5, rook d5. With the last move, I don't know if it was intended. There wasn't, because it seems to me that now Carlsen is getting into a very big position. If now he plays rook e3, and if Carlsen played rook f2, there would be rook d3 and capture on c3. Carlsen would lose a piece. If Carlsen played rook e3, then there is a move rook d3, rook capture d3, c capture d3, knight d5, c takes d5, rook d5, and white seems to be totally okay. So there is a question why Carlsen didn't play rook e3. Now rook e3, and what is important to note is that after rook e3 there is no move king e7 capturing rook d6, and there is this capture idea in this position to play king to e7 and to capture the rook standing on d6 and move rook e3 controls e7 square. So overall, it seems like rook e3 is a possible move, possible and better move than the one that Carlsen made in the game, because it seems to me that the move that was made by Carlsen immediately leads to a losing position. Knight e5, and now just capture with rook. Carlsen has no option but to recapture the rook with the rook to play rook d5, and the pawns, passing pawns, are just a win. It's just a win for black from what I see, and there is no route to escape for white. So rook d5, capture on d5, and passing pawns are extremely dangerous. King f2, but maybe maybe I was mistaken, and maybe Carlsen exactly calculated that he is able to block the pawns, but still it seems that extremely dangerous to white. d4, no, c3, c3, king e1, c2. So it might be just a resignation. I was not mistaken. c3, and Carlsen resigned. So I was not mistaken. Then the move knight d5 was immediately led to a losing position. Instead of this, move rook e3 seems like the only possible move in this position, and one that doesn't lead immediately to a position that is clear how to win for black. So rook e3 was preferable. Thank you for watching.